Yeah? Okay. Thank you. Köszönöm.
Amelyben macskás volt.
Nagyszerű,
Egyre
köszönöm. Köszönöm. Here you go. Okay. Köszönöm szépen. All right, so as after our little introduction, as promised, we're gonna get into deep waters now. So just to give you a warning, we're gonna be reading some text that is not necessarily very user-friendly. This is the reason why the translator, if you look at the translation, left some of the text in bold. That's more like the literal part of the translation. And the text which is not bold, that's trying to make the text easier for the reader. As well as in between, he gave some nice explanations for different topics that are brought into the text and are understood by the author as self-understood, that the reader will know what these topics are. So just you understand, we said before that Chabad Hasidism wants to get these ideas out to the simple person, that it should be accessible to all. It doesn't mean that all means people with absolutely no background in these ideas. So you will come across ideas that you not necessarily understand what they are. And the whole point of our learning together is that we will stop at these points and we'll give you some background and we'll get to know some major topics. And through this, once we'll be going through this day after day in these 2 weeks, you will get to know some of the major topics of Hasidic thought. So, before we go into the first section, just as an introduction, a simple introduction of what we will be learning, is, as the name of this text is, the faith in God. So the name of the section in the Derech Mitzvosecha, in the work of the Tzemach Tzedek, is the Commandment of Faith in God. So really this whole discussion starts off with a major question just on the title itself. How can it be that there is a commandment to have a faith in God? So first of all, logically, it doesn't seem really possible, right? Because if we speak about godly commandments, we need to say, I have one copy last, Kira. So we gave out these copies, but you just got one from Briggy. It's right there, okay? But I will try to make for tomorrow 2 more, I guess, okay? So anyways, what was I saying? Yeah, so it's a contradiction in itself. Why? Because if we speak about godly commandments, we must say that we believe there is a God. If you don't believe there is a God, then who commands to believe in a God? So practically, it doesn't really seem like logical. Like, what does it mean to have a mitzvah, a commandment to have faith in God? So that's the question we're going to start off with. Then there is also a technical side to this. A technical side is that where do we derive from that there is such a mitzvah, such a commandment of having faith in God? So there's one question, a logical question, like, can you say that there's such a commandment to have faith in God when if there is no God, then nobody can command you to have faith in God? But then there's also a technical part to it. And the technical part is, where do we derive from this idea of having a commandment in faith of God? So anybody has a clue? Where would it say in the Torah to have faith in God? Anybody? It's not so complicated, by the way. So it's
depending on how you see it, it's the first of the Aseres Adibros.
Exactly. So it's the first one of the so-called 10 commandments, right? So, if you go into any synagogue, even in this one, if you go on and either on the top of the Torah ark or outside of the building, there is two, what's it called? Two tablets. And in the two tablets, we refer to the 10 major commandments that were given by God himself, not through a mediator like later on, through Moses. And the first one of the 10 commandments is the believe in one God. So if somebody will ask you, what are the 10 commandments? You will say, first one is to believe in God. The second one is not to believe in other gods. So the prohibition of idol worship. The third one is not to take God's name to onto your mouth without a specific reason. The fourth one is Shabbat. The fifth one is to honor your parents, so on and so forth. So the first one is to believe in God. But if you look technically, and again, it's just a technical question on the text, it doesn't really say anywhere, believe in God. So in the second one, it says, don't believe in other gods. Don't serve other gods. The first one doesn't say that. The first one just says, here I am your God who took you out of Egypt. It's like an introduction. Hello, my name is Shlomo Kovesh. So God said, hello, my name is God. You guys remember, I took you out of Egypt. It doesn't say, it's not a fas solito mode, but how you say, it's not in a...
It's not imperative.
It's not imperative. So it's a technical question then. Why do we say that there is such a commandment when it's not in the form of commanding? And then we get into a third question, really, what is really the role of faith? And why do we need faith? The fact that there is a God, is it something that can be derived through cognitive contemplation? Can we get to the understanding that there is a God? Can we get to the conclusion cognitively that there is a God? And if we can, then why do we need faith? Isn't faith in things that we cannot understand? If we can understand that there is a God, then what is the role of faith? And really, what is faith? Where is this faith thing? Is it something? Well, if you would ask my Marxist grandmother, she would say faith is just a weakness. People that don't understand have faith, right? So if we can use our brains, then why would we need faith? Faith is not a positive thing. So what does it mean to have faith in God? Does that mean that's only for people that can't use their brains and therefore they have faith? And in general, is God something understandable? So the question really becomes a double question. So the first question is God something we can come to understand that he exists cognitively? So can we come to the conclusion that there is a God in a cognitive way? That's question number one. Question number two, can we understand God? So if we come to the conclusion that there is a God, there's another question, can we understand this thing which is called God? It's not the same idea. Getting to the conclusion cognitively that there is a God doesn't mean that you get to know this God in a cognitive way. And the third question is in general, the cognitive attributes that we all use for reasoning, these cognitive ideas that are basically the laws of nature, derived from the laws of nature, and we would assume that they are essential parts of nature. Are they essential as much to say that they're even essential in the godly existence? Which means the laws of nature and the set of rules, cognitive rules that they determine, are they essential even for God, or are they created ideas? Can this be understood? So it's no. No. So when I say that there are certain rules of nature that determine logic, right? What is logic? Logic is basically based on rules of nature, right? And the logic that you find in these rules of nature. So, when I say that the rules of nature are essential, logic is essential, Logic is not changeable. It doesn't evolve. It's a set, right? It's a set of rules. So, is logic, as part of nature, essential only on the level of creation, or even on the level of godliness? Can that be understood now? Well, we will get into it more, but basically, the logical aspects of our existence are essential to godliness as well, or God is not ruled and not limited to logic, and logic, the way we know it, is also a created phenomenon. And that's a major question. That's a major question. So, if we say...
If God is omnipotent, He can change the laws of nature as well. For instance, gravitation in our neighborhood is divided by r squared, the gravitation between two bodies. But could be r cubed, why not r cubed, or r 3.5? So in other words...
so God can change the laws of nature.
Can change, or also perhaps it exists.
Right. So you are for the idea that it's a created phenomena. It's a created phenomena that doesn't rule... that doesn't rule God. So God is not limited to the laws of nature or to logic.
Or there could be different laws of nature in different parts of the world,
Right.
universe. Right.
So, but then the first question is, the laws of nature and the logic that is based on these laws of nature, is it something that is determined only on our level, or on all levels? So you say that they are just definitely on our level. In other universes or in other set of existence, there might be other laws of nature, or other laws that that existence is managed by. But then, and if so, then we obviously will say that God is not limited to our laws of nature, right? His existence is not limited to our rules of existence. But then there's another question: do we have to say that there's any types of laws and logic that determines God? Or God himself is somehow above, totally above of any laws and any set of rules and any type of logic? And that is so it's a second level to that question. And it's very hard to imagine an existence that would not be ruled to some type of laws or some type of logic, because whenever you imagine something, you already imagine it by a relationship to some type of laws of logic or nature. But we will tackle, this is one of the major questions that we will deal with here, is is the idea of logic in general, not just our logic, but any logic, is it something determined, or is it something that is a created phenomena by the ungraspable, infinite creator, God? So that's another question we will deal with. Which then, if it's so, it would mean that God first needs to create the idea of logic, the idea of set of rules, and then through them he can create the physical existence. Okay, so we ran a little bit ahead, but let's go back now to our basic questions. The basic question is, do we say, what does it mean? What is the idea of the commandment of believing in God? How could you have a commandment to believe in God if you don't believe in God? So that's a simple question that we're going to start off with. You guys can open on page 1, and I will read, I guess, in English, and sorry if my spelling won't be that perfect.
Prologue.
The prologue, yeah. I'm sorry. So I'm just going to read mostly the original text itself, which is in bold, not necessarily the explanations. Okay, so in the Sefer HaChinuch, in Parshas Yisro, which is Parshas Yisro is in the second book of Moses, in the 10 Commandments, the first commandment is, as we mentioned before, I am God your Lord, who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, out of the house of slavery. This is a positive commandment to know and to believe that there is a God. So the chinuch, who is one of the first collectors of, I don't know if that's the right English word, but of the 613 commandments. So just as a side note, I'm sure you have come across this idea of 613 commandments, right? This is a major phenomenon in Jewish literature. So where does this come from? It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah, these are the 613 commandments, right? It just says, God spoke to Moses mostly, and he said, do this or don't do that. And actually for over 1,000 years, nobody bothered with the fact, so how many of these commandments do we have? It wasn't really an important topic. We find in the Talmud some reference to the fact that there are a certain number of commandments, and the first one to collect this to a certain number there's a saying in the Talmud that there is Taryag mitzvot, that there is 613 commandments, but it doesn't define what are these 613. And you would say, oh, that's simple. Well, just let's count them, right? And we'll get to 613. But it's not so simple, because sometimes it's not really clear if something legally is considered a commandment or a sub-commandment, a commandment or a law in a commandment. So for example, Shabbat. You should rest on Shabbat. That's a commandment. But there is many rules to this commandment. You should not work, you should not light a fire, you should not judge, you should not travel. Are these separate commandments or they're part of one commandment? So it's a legal question. So you really have to play chess here with the number of commandments that it says in the Torah. And the first one who collected and said, look, these are the 613, is Baal Halachas Gdoilas, is one of the Gaonim, one of the major geniuses, major rabbis after the times of the Talmud in Babylonia, who said these are the 613. There were many after him that there is different arguments about. In the Middle Ages, there were major codificators, what we call them, that some of them said these are the 613. No, this is not a mitzvah. This is just a sub mitzvah. So there is a whole place for discussion about what is a commandment, what is considered a commandment, what is not considered a commandment. One of the Middle Ages rabbis who collected the mitzvot, the commandments, is the chinuch. And the chinuch doesn't only collect the mitzvot, he goes through them portion by portion, by Torah portion, and says, okay, this is a commandment, and this is the major idea of this commandment. And he says a few paragraphs about it. And why is this important? Because the future discussion of this text will be that not everybody agrees with the fact that this is a commandment, for the reason that we discussed before. Number one, it's not phrased in a way of a commandment. So it doesn't say, you shall believe in me, I am your God. It just says, hi, I am your God. So it's not a commandment. It's not phrased in a way of a commandment. And number two, it logically doesn't make sense. How could you say that believing in God is a commandment when who commands is God himself? So if you don't believe in him, then why would you accept his commandment? So, but the Tzemach Tzedek first quotes the idea of the chinuch, who states that it is a commandment. Now, look at the text. He says, so the first part of the text is, I'm God, your Lord, who took you out of the land of Egypt, of the house of the bondage. This is a quote from the text, from the script itself, right? Then he quotes what the chinuch says about it right away. What does the chinuch says? And this is a definition. This is a positive commandment to know and believe that there is a God. Now let's take this apart, okay? This is a positive commandment. What does it mean, positive commandment? Well, in Jewish halachic literature, we differentiate between positive and negative commandments. It means, you could call it, in Hebrew we call it mitzvat aseh, or mitzvat lo taseh, a commandment that calls for action, or a commandment that calls to not to do something. I don't know how you say that in English. To refrain from doing something, right? So, for example, to put on tefillin is a positive commandment. Not to light a fire on Shabbat is a negative commandment. Now, first of all, so he says it's a positive commandment, which means it's a call for action. So it brings another question to light. Believing is an action? Or that's the state of mind? It's not something. So if you say to put on tefillin, that's an action, right? Or to get married, have children. These are all positive commandments that have an action to it. What is believing have to do with action? It's not an action. It's not how can it be a call for action? Even a commandment, they say, love God, which according to many commentaries is a positive commandment. You could say, well, you should feel the feeling of love in your heart. The same way you feel love to a woman or to a man, you should feel a feeling of love. Your heart should pump when you think about God. So there is a physical it entails a physical part of action. Believing, what do you do when you believe? What's the action of believing? So that's an issue to deal with. But the chinuch still says it's a positive commandment. That's number one. To know and to believe that there is a God. Wow. So let's take this apart as well. To know and to believe. He doesn't just say to believe. He says to know. What does this mean? So if we refer to our discussion before we started reading the text, we said, how does knowledge come into faith of God? So can we derive cognitively, intellectually there is a God? So when the chinuch says it's a positive commandment to know that there is a God, does it mean that we should work on contemplating until we come to the conclusion that there is a God, and then it's a positive action of knowing that there is a God? Or does it mean maybe even more than that, to know, meaning to get to know God, which is not the same thing. One is about, I came to the conclusion by knowledge, by cognitive contemplation that there is a God. Or, for example, I came to the conclusion there was a man whose name was Shakespeare. That's one thing. Then I came to know Shakespeare. It's different, right? So, is it the knowing of God? Does it mean to know God, that there is a God? Or to know Him, to get to know Him? Well, how do you get to know something which is infinite? Can you get to know God? So that's about this word. And then it says, and believe. Wait, so if you got to know either that there is a God, or you got to know God, then what is the role of believing? Believe is always in something which I can get to know. I believe I can do pretty well in my math test. Once I did it, then there's nothing to believe in. I know it. It's not something I believe in, right? So if I have the positive commandment to know God, then what is left for believing? I don't need to believe in anything because I know it. So what is it? What is there to believe in? So that's something we need to take apart. And then there is a third question in this text, that there is a God. It doesn't say you should that there is a commandment to know and to believe that God took us out of Egypt, or God is so and so. Just that there is a God. What does that mean? So what differentiates our God from other gods? So then, is the commandment to know our God, to believe in our God, or it's just in general that there is something which is called godliness? So these are all questions that we need to deal with. But this is what the chinuch says. And now, in this prologue, the Tzemach Tzedek will quote many of the Middle Age, many of the codificators of the Middle Ages, and he will quote what they say about this commandment. So this was the chinuch. Now let's go to the Rambam. The Rambam, the Maimonides, in his Sefer HaMitzvos, mentions this as the first positive commandments, and he explains it in the following way. He says like this: the first mitzvah that he commanded us is the commandment to believe in God. What does that mean? To believe that there is a cause and a motivation that brings into being all entities that exist. As it is written I am God your Lord. So what does the Rambam say? The Rambam says that we should believe that there is a cause and a motivation that brings all entities into existence. This is something which is referred to in the Rambam's. So this quotation is from the Rambam's Sefer HaMitzvos. So that just for you to know, there is the Rambam wrote. The
Rambam lived before this.
The Chinuch, yeah. So the Rambam's major work is the Mishneh Torah. Which is the only book which was ever put together that has the whole Jewish halacha in one set of books. It's 14 books. And the first book of the 14 is called the Sefer Hamada. And in this book, there is the first part about beliefs, right? And then the Rambam has another book which is called Sefer HaMitzvot. Sefer HaMitzvot is the book of mitzvot, which just in short, based on the same logic that he goes through in Mishneh Torah, he lists in short the 613 mitzvot. Now, this quote is from the Sefer HaMitzvot, but the same idea is mentioned in the book of Hilchot Yisodei HaTorah. In Sefer HaMadah there is a section which is called the basic thoughts of Torah. And he starts off basically this whole book by saying, the major foundations of all knowledge and wisdom is to know that there is an original being, the kol hanimtzoim, and all beings come from him. And if you would take away all beings, this major being would still exist. But if you would take away that major being, nothing else would exist. So that's in more length than to what it says here. But what's interesting about this, in my opinion, about this phrase, the phrase of what he says here, that he doesn't name this God. He doesn't say, and this is our God who took us out of Egypt, or this is the God who whatever. He just says, Leida sheyesham motzei rishon. You should know that there is an original existence that brought all other existences into existence. Just one second. Which means this is something, it seems to me, that this is something that is still not a religious thought. It's not a thought about what this God or this existence is expecting from us. It's just the fact that you should know that nothing comes by itself, and it has to be an original being that brought everything else to existence. Yes, I'm sorry.
In the beginning of the Genesis, it says that material already existed and God already existed. And God made order of the material.
Where does it say this?
In the very beginning.
Where?
It says there was darkness and that matter was already there.
Yeah, what does it say before that?
It doesn't say anything about it.
Doesn't? What's the first sentence?
My reading of the
So what is the first sentence of the Genesis? Do you remember? Breishis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. At first, God created heaven and earth. And then it says it was all darkness and he made order. It's true. But according to all Jewish commentaries that I came across, there is the idea of creation ex nihilo, which means that the creation is from nothing to something. There's a different question though, and that question is a very good question. Not question, but I guess an idea, is that in the Genesis, it doesn't speak about God. It doesn't say who God is. It just takes it for granted. It's like, it's already there. But I don't think it says in Genesis that that material already existed. Not at all.
Well, the first thing he said, let be light.
Yes.
Yes. So he tries to make order from the already existing matter.
You want to take out Genesis and tell me where you mean it?
So you are right.
I don't want to. You guys, I don't want to go away from our text, but it has to do. It's a major topic in our text, so we have to make order in it. Let's let there be light.
Okay, the very first sentence, you are right. It says Elohim, but then
no, it's not just Elohim.
The matter is there, and there is
because He created
earth.
it. He said, "Breshit bara Elokim." In the beginning, God created the heavens and earth, and the earth was tohu vevohu, was a whole. How you say tohu vevohu? Was a chaos. V'choshech al pnei tahom, and was darkness above the deepness. V'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim, and God's spirit was hovering over the face of the waters. Vayomer Elokim yior, and then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and then God separated the light from darkness. Whatever this means, it's something needs a more deeper understanding. We're not going to get into it. Obviously, the Jewish philosophers and commentators explain this text in a philosophical term, but it doesn't say anywhere that material existed. It says just the opposite. It says, at the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The only thing that was pre-existing before creation is God. Actually, in the Talmud it says that the first translation of the Torah was done by is the Septuaginta, and was done by Yanai, Melech Yanai, and he called the 70 sages and put them in separate rooms in order that they should translate the right way, and he would find out what. And they all made it says in the Megillah tractate of the Talmud that they made 28 changes to the text. And they all made the same changes. And the first change they made was in the first sentence, because they translated, instead of saying, "In the beginning, God created heaven and earth," they all wrote, "God created in the beginning heaven and earth." Why did they do that? Because they were afraid that if in Greek if he would read, "In the beginning, God created," he would think that it means, "In the beginning created God, and then He created heaven and earth." And they wanted to make sure that he would understand that there's only thing that pre-existed creation is God. It doesn't say anywhere, to my knowledge, that there was material before creation.
But does heaven and earth include all matter?
Yes, not only that, most of the commentators have a problem with this heaven and earth issue, because they say that later on it speaks about it says Rekia Hashamayim and Haaretz, that God created heavens from earth, and it uses a different word. It uses Rekia. So what is it? And it's only later on in the third and the fourth day. So most of the commentators say that here, when it says heaven and earth, it means heaven, spiritual existence, and earth, physical existence. So God created in the beginning the spiritual world and the physical world. Not only physical material didn't exist, even spiritual material didn't exist. So it's even the spiritual existence is a creatio ex nihilo. It's a existence. It's a creation from of something out of nothing.
Okay, pretty convincing, but I will think about it.
Okay, it's worth thinking about. It's one of these things I don't stop thinking about. Okay, so what we got up to till now. So we had the Chinuch, we had the Rambam, and then there is the Ramban, right? The Ramban, almost the same name as the Rambam, just instead of Reb Moshe ben Maimon, it's Reb Moshe ben Nachman, so it's called Nachmanides, and he's around the same time as the Rambam, and he goes like this. Ramban cites the opinion of the author of Halachas Doilas, who did not include in the 613. So here we have suddenly a third opinion. Before getting into the Ramban, let's just speak about the Halachas Doilas, the Bahag. I think the Bahag is the Side Yagon, I'm not sure, but the Bahag, who is the first one who collected the 613. Halachas Gedolos, okay? Who did not include this in the 613. Suddenly we have a codificator that says that the belief in God is not part of the 613 mitzvot. So let's just make sure we follow who we are talking about. Okay, so we said first we had the chinuch. The chinuch said it is a mitzvah. Then we had the Rambam. The Rambam also said it's a mitzvah. Then we had the Bahag. Bahag is acronym, but we're going to use it from now. He says it's not part of the 613. We'll get back to it why. The Ramban, he says it's part of the 613, but he feels like the Bahag has a reason to say it's not. So he needs to explain why it is. So he will quote the Bahag. He will say what the Bahag says, why it's not. And then he will go into explain why he does think, though, that it is. So let's read what he quotes from the Bahag. We turn the page. It appears that the opinion of the author of the Halachas Doilus is that reckoning the 630 mitzvot includes only his decrees that he decreed upon us to observe, or that he enjoined us against doing. By contrast, faith in his existence, which he made known to us with signs and wonders and through revelation of his presence before our eyes, is the basis and the root from which all the mitzvahs are spanned, and it is not included in the reckoning. So what does he say? He quotes the Bahag and he goes like this. He says, you cannot have a commandment to believe in a commander. How can you have a commandment to believe in a commander, as we mentioned many times? If there is no commander, then who commands? Simple as that. So the Bahag says, all the 613, their pre-assumption is that there is a commander. If you don't have that, man, then there's nothing to talk about. So therefore, he doesn't include that in the 613. The Ramban feels like, oh, this is a good point. I have to explain why I do think it is part of the 613. So what does he say? He says, just jump a little bit. Nevertheless, Ramban himself, look at 2 lines from the bottom. The Ramban himself agrees with Rambam's position. Look on the blackboard, you will see the Rambam says that it is a mitzvah. Why? For something very interesting. Because we have been, look at the third line, it's just a very like ancient type of text, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Just look at the third line from the page 3. What does the Ramban say? We have been commanded in the first mitzvah to accept the sovereignty of heaven, to believe that there is a God who causes all existence, bringing into being from absolute nothingness into the state of being which is found, and the state of being he desires at all times. This is his, by his statement, I am God your Lord who took you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Right? So what is his explanation? His explanation is, basically the Ramban, it's less understood from here, but if you look in the sources, the Ramban says that basically the commandment is not just to believe there is a God, because obviously if you believe that if you don't believe in it, that there is a God, there's nothing to believe in. Nobody to command you that they should believe in it. But it is a certain aspect of this God, and that is the sovereignty of God, which means that basically this God that you believe in is, number one, sovereign. I'll explain in a second what that means. I don't know how you spell that, I'm sorry. Number 2, he is active. What does it mean? So sovereign means he's not dependent on anything else. So basically, the difference between God and all other existence, based on this explanation, is every existence that we know is dependent on something else, right? You are here because you had parents. They are here because they had parents. This chair is here because somebody made it, and there is oil in the ground that you could make plastic out of. Everything depends on something else. Every existence has a relationship with other existence. God is a sovereign existence, which means he's not dependent on anything. And what the Ramban says, true, if you don't believe in basic idea of God, there's nothing to talk about. But the fact that you believe in God doesn't mean that you understand that this God is sovereign. You have to know that this God is sovereign. It's not just, and that's what makes him God. That's issue number one. I don't know if that's understood. And issue number two, which is more explained in depth in the Ramban himself, is the idea that he's active. What does it mean that he's active? It means that, what does it say in this quote? It says, "I'm your God who took you out of Egypt, the house of slavery." Means I'm a God that didn't only create you. I'm a God that is active in forming history, and active in forming your fate. So again, just because you believe that there is some initial force that made our existence, it doesn't mean that this force has an active role in shaping our lives or our fate today. The Ramban says this is also included. That's why it says, the Ramban says, not here, but in the original text, just one second, it says, why does it say in the first commandment, I am your God who took you out of Egypt? Why doesn't it say, I'm your God who created the world? Would be much stronger statement, right? So he says it's because he wants to say, I'm your God, which is not only an initial force that made everything to become to existence, but I'm a God that is active in shaping history. And that's why I introduce myself as the God that took you out of Egypt. You had a question?
Yes, I'm just trying to make sure I understand. So the author of Halachas Gedolos seems to say that belief in God is not a mitzvah because it is the a priori assumption upon which all other mitzvahs are built. The Ramban doesn't actually reject this, just says that acceptance of other mitzvahs is a byproduct of this first mitzvah?
No, you got it wrong. The ideas you have right, but just the references. The Baal Halachas Gedolos says it cannot be a mitzvah to believe in God because the mitzvahs are a collection of things that this God said. So obviously the mitzvahs are a byproduct of believing in God. That's where the byproduct issue comes in. So Baal Halachas Gedolos himself says mitzvahs, the commandments, are a byproduct of believing in a commander. So you cannot say believing in a commander itself is a mitzvah. The Ramban says, I understand his problem, but I have an explanation for this. My explanation is, it's although true that the basic belief in God is a basis for commandments, and that cannot be considered a commandment, but details of this belief, for example, the fact that God is sovereign, and for example, the fact that God is active in history, that's something which is a commandment by the commander. Is that clear now?
So it's not it's belief in the specificity that it is.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
May sound a little provocative. Like,
Yeah, please.
could it be read like, because there is this one unique God who, and unique people. I mean, this message I have brought you from the land of Egypt, from slavery, like there is a precondition, like the others, so to speak, still are in slavery, and there is an action. I mean, if you believe in God, so
It takes you out of this state.
I mean, symbolically,
Yeah.
like slavery, so to speak, like
Yeah.
you become the essence of the,
You become free.
yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, that's a very, I don't think it's provocative. I like it very much. It's a very nice and interesting perspective on this verse. And actually, it's not just your perspective. It's a very common perspective by the Jewish commentators on this verse. And this is the general idea of why we so strongly believe in this mentioning and discussing the leaving of Egypt. Why is it such an essential part of Jewish thought? Because it symbolically explains how you can bring yourself to freedom, to free yourself from all other things of the physical world. And the whole story of leaving Egypt is really it's not only it happened physically, but it's also a metaphor for getting to ultimate freedom. But that doesn't really, it's an important aspect, doesn't have to do with this discussion really, because the discussion about, okay, so is believing God a commandment or not a commandment, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is what we got up to till now. So we had now 4 opinions, which 3 out of the 4 believed, or stated, I would say, that the believing God is a commandment in one way and another. Okay? So actually the Ramban was the most specific about it. He said, as Sam said, he brought he says, the specifications of this belief is the commandment. The thing itself cannot be a commandment. The 2 other ones, the Chinuch and the Rambam, they were more general. They just said the knowing and the believing, which we need to specify what that means. We didn't really get to understanding what it means. Now we're going to get to a 4th source, and that's a mystical source. That's the Zohar. Turn the page to page 4. So, Raya Mehemna is a certain... Okay, so Zohar, okay? Zohar is one of the basic books of Kabbalah. Right? I'm sure we've all heard about it. And according to our tradition, the Zohar was written by a Talmudic sage called Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. But we should all know that this text was not revealed for 1,000 years. So the Zohar came to revelation only, I think, in the 13th century. But it's a very basic Kabbalistic text. And the Raya Mehemna, the faithful shepherd, which is a section of this book, says the following about this same verse in Torah. No, not the same verse. A similar verse where God introduces himself, says like this. This mitzvah is the first of all mitzvahs. So it seems like, first of all, the Zohar says it is a mitzvah. And then it defines it, and it goes like this. Since the people knew this commandment in general sense, this is something that made them possible to knowing it in a particular way. And what is the particular way? Well, this is going to get really Kabbalistic. That Havaya is Elokim. Whoa. So he's now going into something very mystical, much more mystical than Ramban. He says, guys, true. In general, this is something you could get to know this knowledge. You don't need to have this commandment in order to know that there is a God. But there is one thing you need a commandment for, and that is that Havaya Elokim. That Havaya is Elokim. What does it mean? That Havaya, which is the 4-letter name of God, is Elokim, which is a other name of God. So I will write it in Hebrew, okay? Actually, this is not the way we write this name, but you're not supposed to write this name literally. Okay? So these are 2 holy names of God. And now, just before we get into what this means, just to get a little sense of what this means, the Zohar is probably mentioning this for the same question that the Bahak had. It's a good question, and yet you need to deal with it. The Bahak's question is, again, if you don't believe in God, then who commands you to believe in God? So Ramban gave one answer to it, and now the Zohar is giving another answer. And this answer, which really leads us and leads the Tzemach Tzedek to dwell into more depth of the idea of belief and understanding and what the relationship is a mystical answer which he just says in short, that Havaya is Elokim. What is this in short? What does this mean? So in general, in order to understand this, we need to know that God has many names in the Torah, right? We call God in many different ways, and Moses himself calls him in many ways, and then the Psalms and other scripts. But there is in the Talmud, it says there are 7 holy names of God, right? And these 7 holy names differ from other names halachically in the practice, as far as that these names are included in the prohibition to say God's name or to write down God's name without a good reason, without being part of a prayer or being part of a Torah verse. These names are all holy names. The Kabbalah, and unlike other names of God, which is more like Yalem Zeish, how would you say that in English?
Attribute.
Like an attribute that we associate God with. Like God is great. You can say great. You can say God is peace. Shalom. It's also a name of God, but it's not a holy name. Comes Kabbalah and says these names don't only differ because they are holy in the practice. They are also different in their essence. What is a name? The Kabbalah says. What is the meaning of a name? What is the idea of a name? So, what is a name for? I would ask you, what's a name? What's the purpose of a name? You tell me, just, in order that you should have a name, they should call you. You should say, instead of say, hi, who? I tell you Sam. So you look at me and that's the purpose of a name.
In this Havaya, the Yod is shifted to the left.
Yeah. Why? The reason why we do that is because it's such a holy name that we don't want to write it down in the normal sequence, because then it would read the holy name. Therefore, in order to refer to it in a way that we should know what the name we are talking about, but still not to write it down or not to express it in its normal sequence, we call it Havaya. But you could put together the name the way it is in your mind. You could imagine what the name is. Okay, so let's get back to the idea of names. What is the idea of a name? So why do we have a name? You say, well, I have a name. People should call me. So, but the Kabbalah says, no, a name is more than just a practical tool for relationships. A name really expresses who you are. So that's why the Kabbalah says, for example, that your Jewish name is a little prophecy. When your parents gave you the name Shmuel, that's Sam, they actually had a prophecy because this name suits your personality the most. This is who you are. It expresses who you are. That's why we say it's a nevuah ktana. A person getting a name is a small prophecy by his parents or by himself if he gives himself. And actually, we do see that besides your name, people can call you names, and they really express who you are, right? So you say Dad. That expresses who you are. You're a father. Say, hey, boss. It expresses also who you are. If they could call you, hey, buddy, it expresses a different type of personality, right? And actually, if we look in more depth, can we have a person that has a name, buddy, bro, dad, boss? We can have one person that has all these names. How is that? So who is he? So, well, it's not really who he is. It's the way he reveals himself to the person that calls him with that name, right? So you have a guy that he goes home to his parents' house, he's bro to his brothers or his sisters. When he goes home to his wife and children, he's dad. When he goes to work, he is boss. And each one is true. He has a different side of him being revealed in another circumstance. It's all him, but just a different state of mind, a different state of existence. And the name is really the relationship to that person. And what is that relationship based upon? It's based upon the way he reveals himself. So obviously a person hopefully will act a bit differently in his workplace than at home, right? It's not a very healthy home if you call the dad boss. So it shows something unhealthy in those relationships. He reveals himself probably the wrong way at home. And the same thing is true at workplace. Like imagine if they would call somebody dad at his workplace. Anyways, so that is because you need to reveal another side of you in each circumstance. But then, who are you? Who is your essence? Is there a name for your essence? So, not really, because it's really hard to tap on your essence. Like, well, any name I'm going to call you, I'm going to define you in a certain way. Your essence is really undefinable, so it's very hard to get a name for your essence. So Kabbalah says the same true with God. God reveals himself in each circumstance differently. So when God reveals himself in his anger, state of anger, let's call it that way. It's a whole different question, how can God be angry, but we're not going to get into it right now. So then we call him the strict one, Elokim, right, the judge. When God reveals himself as the savior of Jewish people, we'll call him Hashem Tzvakot, the God of, I don't know how you translate that to
Hosts.
Tzvaot is Shereg Akura. So,
Hosts. Yeah.
So each name is another revelation of God. And there is many revelations of God. But these revelations are the most general ones. And that's why we have 7 names. Now, one out of these 7 names, the holiest one is the holiest one. Actually, the 7 names are, let's try to remember that. It's Elokim, El, Shin Dalet Yud, Tzvaot, Eloha. What did I miss? Adnai. We have so far 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And what is the holiest name? We didn't write down. Is the 4-letter name. I'm not going to change the sequence just for you. But from now we will. I'm just putting these little lines into it so we don't transgress.
What about the 42-letter name?
Oh, that's a whole different story. We'll get to it in a second. So basically, okay, you want to know? Basically, let's just one second before we get into 42 letters. There is 42 letters, 72 letters. It's a whole Torah to itself. It's a whole. But let's first just see this 4-letter name. So the interesting thing about all the names, they most have a translation. You can translate it. This name is a little hard to translate. So, what is this? This name could either have 2 major meanings. It's either a meaning of lehavot, to create, which is from the word of existence, haveh, lehaveh. Or it could mean, if you look at it, it has all the letters in order to put out the 3, so the past, present, future. How you say that in English?
Tenses.
Tenses?
Yeah.
So it has all the 3 tenses. Haya, Hoveh, Yeh. Was, is, will be. So, what is the difference? They both are something very essential. So, for example, when we speak about Elokim, which is usually associated with God being angry or punishing, the punishing God. So that's one attribute of God, obviously, but it's not the only one. When we speak about Eloha or Shaddai, that's more of his kindness, right? But Hoveh, to create, is something extremely essential. And this is even more essential, saying he's past, present, future, because it's almost like saying, getting back to our question, who are you? You have many names, you're dad, bro, buddy, boss, but who are you? Well, it's very hard to say who I am. Essentially, I myself don't really know who I am. It's something very essential. It's really hard to express in a name. Well, saying if you are past, present, and future, you're basically everything and nothing, then that's the most essential way to describe you. I didn't really describe. It's hard. It's not a description to say you were, you are, you will be. That's not really a description. Getting back to our discussion with Moses and God about what is your name? And he says, I will be who I will be. Well, I asked about your name. And God is saying, look, I can give you names, but essentially, this is who I am. Who am I? I am who I am. Like, it's something it's very hard to say in a name. And this is why we don't express this name. Because this is a description, what's unexpressible. It's not something you can express. It's like ungraspable. It's really above our understanding. And this is really who God is, essentially. Well, not to going to all, we can get even to more deeper levels, but we can say everything else is about the way God relates to us, with the way God has a connection with his creatures. For a relationship, you need two guys, right? You need him and something else outside of him. The only name that expresses him as he is without us is this name, right? Think about it this way. When you speak about a relationship, or a name in general, if I would be just me, it would be a beautiful state of mind. Nobody else besides me in the whole existence just would be me. I wouldn't need a name, right? Because the name you need for a relationship. The second I have another thing besides me, you need somebody to call me. So how should I call you? Well, call me Shlomo, or call me boss, or call me rabbi, or call me chief rabbi, whatever it is. But if I would just be myself, without any other existence besides me, I wouldn't need a name, right? So any relationship and name is when it predicts that should be two things at least. So there is a God and there's creatures. So all names is true. There's one name though, which is almost as, well, this is his essential name. This is the name when he was just by himself, without anything else. This is the way he should have been called if anybody would call him. There was nobody to call him because he was by himself. But if there would be someone still to call him, this is his essential name. Why? Because it's not about what he does or the way he relates to us. It's about past, present, future, everything. Above time. So,
number 4, what was number 4?
Tzvaot. I spelled it wrong, by the way. I left out of this. This is the Shereg Agura. Okay, so I'm not going to get into all the particular meanings of all the names. I'm myself I'm not fully prepared now for a lesson about it. But this is the general idea. Now, I'm sorry. When we get to this name, the was, is, will be. So this is God in his essential existence, in his infinite existence. Right? So this is infinity. Is there such a word in English?
It's timeless.
Huh?
You could say infinity, but it's timeless.
Yeah, but it's okay. Well, let's call it now infinity for the sake of our. So this is God Himself, without him being in a relationship with us or with anything else besides Him. I just want to say a thing before we go on. Your question about the 42 letters and the whole thing. So it's a whole Kabbalistic discussion. And basically the discussion is that this name has many versions. Yud Hei Vav Hei, the Havaya name, has many versions. And basically the versions are based on how you spell it. If you would say, just as for a side note, so if you would say, you could write it down in many ways. How could you write it down? You could say Yud Hei Vav Hei. If you want to write it down the way you express it, this is how we write it. But you could also write it down Yud Hei Vav Hei. Or you could write it down. There's many ways of writing down. Now these different combinations of spellings and their numerical value. This is the idea of 42 letters, 42 numerical values, 26, 72, and this is a whole Kabbalistic thought behind it. When is it this way? When is it that way? It's a thing we're not going to get into, but this is just to answer your question. Now, getting back to our discussion, we said this name is infinity. This is God Himself, the essence of God. What is Elokim? Where is this name used, Elokim? You brought it up. Where was it used?
Beginning.
Where?
In the beginning.
In the beginning, creation. So Elokim is creation. So in the Zohar and in Kabbalah, whenever we speak about God, the way He relates to the world, the most common name is Elokim. That's godliness the way we know it, or we can get to know it. Havaya, Yud K Vav K, is godliness the way we could never know it. It's the ungraspable, ununderstandable infinity, the essential godliness. So when we say that Havaya, Hu Elokim, that God is, that Havaya is Elokim, what does that mean? That it's equal. What did we say? We said, if you go back, that according to the Zohar, the meaning of the commandment that you should believe in is that you should know that Havaya Hu Elokim. You should know that God is God. Oh, thanks, I knew that. Well, that's not a big deal to know. Like, right? If you'd say, well, Professor Kegel, he's here called the professor. At home, he's called Dad. It's the same person. Oh, sure, it's the same person. Why do you need to commend to say that? It's not a major. That's self-understood. So, what does it mean to know that the commandment is to know that God is God? Well, that's a whole discussion to itself. But practically, what it would mean is, basically, the question is, God is the ultimate existence. He created something else outside of Him. And not only in the second He created this other thing outside of Him, that predicted that He needs to have a relationship with that other thing which He created, because the creation itself is already a relationship with the thing that He created, right? Well, did that change His original status? Understand? So, for example, when I say Michael is the professor, it's not true. Because before Michael became a professor, he was just Michael. He was not a professor. Once he became a professor, it's not the same Michael. And the same true, even stronger, when somebody becomes a father. So when you become a dad, you're not the same person that you were before. You can say, no, I am. It's just my relationship with a new thing, but I'm the same guy. No, it affects you backwards also, right? So you're not the same person. You're a different person. So it's not true to say that Michael is the professor and he's the dad and he's the boss. It's not true. Because all these relationships affect his essential existence as well. And this is the question about God. Is God changeable? Because if God originally existed, and He existed on His own, in an infinite, ununderstandable, ungraspable way, and now suddenly He created the creation, the graspable, understandable, logical creation. You can say, well, it didn't affect Him. It's just the things that He created. It's not true. If you do something, it affects you. It affects you back. So He cannot say, He can never be the same God again. He was the God before He created other things, and now He's the God which created things. So it's not the same God. What does the Zohar says? It is the same God. He never changed. So it's Elokim doesn't change Havaya, and that is the thing you need to believe in. This is what the Zohar says. Havaya Hu Elokim means the God who creates doesn't change the God of the real, original. It's the same God. Well, it's not true. It's not the same God. We just said if Michael becomes a father, he will never be the same Michael. He was Michael and now he's dead. So it affects him. Well, it's really hard to understand. How is it true what it be saying the prayer? Atu at shaloi nivra olam, atu misha nivra olam. You're the same God before you created us, and you're the same God after you created us. Is it true? Is it something we can understand? No, not really. We cannot understand it. That's why you need to believe in it. Here's where belief comes in. It's not something you can understand. You can understand that there is a God. For that you don't need a commandment. But you need a commandment to believe that this God didn't change by creation. That's a major idea, because that answers the question in such a deep way. The Bahak said what is the commandment to believe in God? First of all, you don't need a commandment. You shouldn't have a commandment to believe in the commander. But even deeper, you don't need a commandment to believe in God because you can come to it with a cognitive conclusion. So the Zohar says, yes, you can come in a cognitive conclusion. Actually, it's the most logical thing to say that there is a pre-existence, as the Rambam said it, and as the Chinuch said it, that there is an ultimate, original source of our existence that made everything else to exist. For that, you don't need a commandment. You need a commandment to believe that this existence didn't change after He created everything else, which is something which is pretty ununderstandable. And that's why you need the belief. Okay. So, and this is the idea which, the last thing which Zohar just said, is the idea of yichud, of the oneness of God. Okay? So before we're going to go out for our break, let's speak a bit about the oneness of God. So, the Chinuch says that there is two, yeah, right? The Chinuch on the top of the page. The Chinuch says there's actually two commandments. There's one commandment to believe. Oops. One commandment to believe. Another commandment to believe in oneness. Oneness is the right word for Achdus Hashem? Oneness. Unity. Oneness or unity. So, what is the idea of oneness? The idea of oneness is, just in the simple sense, is the idea of monotheism, right? There's only one God. But in a deeper level, it shouldn't be just to believe there is one God, because actually it has to have a deeper meaning. It sounds pretty primitive to say that the idea of monotheism is, well, the guys think that there's many gods and we just say there's one God. I mean, anybody that has a little brains in his head would come to the conclusion that there is one God. We need to say something deeper than that. We need to say that this God, which is the pre-existence of all, is the ultimate and almost to say only real existence. There's nothing else besides Him, which is a real existence. And why? Because this is the only existence that doesn't need a reason to exist. Everything else is existing on a condition. This is existing unconditionally. And that's why it's really the ultimate existence. Just one second. And the Chinuch says, just a practical note, the Chinuch says this is two separate mitzvot, two separate commandments, to believe and to believe in its unity. The Zohar says, no, the belief itself is this, to know Havaya Hu Elokim, that it's ultimately one and it never changes. Yes, question.
You mentioned the reason, I just can't repeat the sentence, but some say human being, or let's say a man created God in order, this is the reason. I mean, there is no reason for God. So there is this correlation,
Hogy képmására teremtette az embert, az ember teremtette a képmására őt. You speak Hungarian?
Yes.
I just formed a hard. So he created God. So man created God on his own image.
Reason.
Right.
Why? Some people don't have any reason to believe in God. It's not.
Okay, that's true. But what are you trying to get to?
Yeah, I can't repeat your sentence. Just caught me this. When I was in Budapest, in Iraq, we were told God needs a human being. So the man needs actually. Man created the idea
of God,
so to speak.
Okay.
If I put it very simply.
Fine.
So, or is it a precondition that every human being needs to believe in God? There is a reason.
I think there's I'm trying to understand what your question is. And I think there could be many questions that you're asking. Are you certain about one question, or you yourself are not certain what you're asking?
You said, again, I can't repeat the sentence you said, because then there were a few other sentences. What is the reason for a human being to believe there is
a God?
Yes.
Well, well,
I mean,
yeah. So first of all, this question can be stated in many ways. The question can be: is there an ultimate psychological need for a person to believe in God? And I would reason that there is, because there is a psychological attribute of a person in faith, that which is called faith. So people believe in things and tend to believe in things the same way people love or people hate or people understand. There's a capacity of to have faith, but that's just about the psychological state of human beings. It's not about the object of what they have a faith in or they believe in. So we're not speaking about the human psyche now. We're speaking about what the belief is in, the object of the belief, the object of faith. So if the question is then about the object of faith, then the question is the belief in God logically derivable? Is it something that you could logically derive, logically explain, and get to a conclusion? All commentaries, which are mentioned here, believe and reason that to know that there is a God, you don't need to believe. You don't need to use your faith. You could get to understand that there is a God. It's something which is logical. It's much more logical than to say that there isn't a God. And therefore, it's a logically derivable thing to know that there is a God. But then there's a question, then what is belief for? If you could get to it by reason, you will get to it by reason. You don't need to believe in it. And for this is the answer of either the Ramban or the Zohar, that there is a certain specification of this God that is either not necessarily derivable logically or ununderstandable logically, like this is what the Zohar says. I don't know if I managed to answer your question or...
well, not really, but never mind.
I'm sorry. Yes, Sam?
I was going to say, I think what they're getting at in terms of belief in God, they define God very loosely in their initial thing about belief in a God, right? In the generalized mitzvah, right? Where they say, like the Rambam says, you just have to know that there is a motivating cause for the universe. They're not talking about necessarily a cosmological God that created the universe in 6 days and acts upon history.
Right.
That there's a motivating force.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be theological. The secondary specific mitzvah is the one that is not necessarily motivated by logic, and that's the belief in the God of the Torah.
Right.
The generalized one can be, a God, I don't know, your God can be existentialist philosophy. There's no reason it can't be.
Well, if you base it, yes, basically, if you to generally make some conclusions about what, it doesn't say it here, but to make some conclusions about what we just learned before we get to lunch break and then to section 1, is that there is certain aspects of our relationship with God that are solely logical and they don't need no beliefs, no faith, no Torah. And that is the way you just said it. Just the fact that there has to be some type of pre-existence, that a determined ultimate existence that brought everything else to being. And that's not something you need belief in. Even you could say anything. You could call it anything else, but it's and the belief aspect is in certain specifications of this ultimate existence that are much harder to be explained by logic. Now the question, and that could be different things, either acts upon history, or is Havaya Elokim, different specifications of this godliness. But then, really, the next section I think will touch upon this question is all these things that, for example, God doesn't change, and creation didn't change him. Is that really something that, based on belief, isn't that something that can also be derived logically? Even more so. If you derive logically that there is a God, you must also derive logically he doesn't change and he's one. Because otherwise your equation doesn't work. And if so, then there's nothing left again for belief, right? So this is really the question. Ultimately, it's you could prove that there is a God, and once you prove that there is a God, you also must prove these other specifications from it. Maybe not the idea that it acts upon history, that not, but the fact that it doesn't change, for example, and it's one, it's unity. If it's not part of your equation, then your whole equation is wrong. We'll get to this in the next section.
Returning to the beginning of the Torah.
Yeah, you thought about it.
It depends on the original meaning of bara. God created or God shaped?
Yeah, it's created.
Now,
because in Hebrew, to shape is yotzer. Yotzer. That's the word for shape.
But who knows what happened 3,000 years ago? What was the meaning of the bara?
Well, then who knows what happened 3,000 years ago and what is the meaning of God? So, the thing with this is, it's linguistics. So, there's a famous story with, I think, Rabbi Akiva, that this guy came to him, this proselyte, and he said, I want to learn with you. He said, okay, let's learn. So he said, okay, so this is Aleph. He said, okay, this is Aleph. This is Beit. This is Beit. Okay, but how do you know that this is Aleph and this is Beit? Maybe this is Beit and this is Aleph. And then the whole Torah reads different. So Rabbi Akiva said, all right, and he pulled his hair. This guy said, oh, it hurts. He says, how do you know it? Why do you scream? He said, well, that's my hair. How do you know it's your hair? Maybe it's my hair. So meaning there's certain axioms that if you don't accept them, then there is nothing to discuss.
Okay, I base this on something which is a linguistical thing. So, is it shape or create? Okay, I'm using a non-Jewish source, but a linguistical source. So
okay, so the question is not so much. Look, the Torah is not just it's a good point what you're saying. You read something in the text. What is the meaning of the text? That's basically your question. Shlomo says this, but who says that that's the meaning? Maybe it's something else. So now, the Torah is not just, it's not a text, an ancient text that we found now and we need to figure out what it is. The Torah itself is a live text, which means it's being explained constantly from generation to generation. So there is an oral tradition with the text that helps us understand how this text was understood for thousands of years. All I'm saying, the way this text was understood for thousands of years is this, that bara means to create. You can say that maybe this text was given by some aliens from Mars, and they had a whole different way of reading it, and it means something else. Yeah, that could be. But if your question is, what is the Jewish tradition of understanding this text? Is this because the Torah is not something which is a standalone text. It's a text that is accompanied by a certain verbal tradition, and that verbal tradition is very clear about what bara means.
Okay.
But I see what you're saying. I can just tell you from all my studies, which is not much, but as far as I know, there is no Jewish source that says that the creation was just a formation of some pre-existed thing. There's no such thing. There's no such explanation. Even if there are some quotes from the Talmud that God created and destroyed worlds, and there's 600,000 worlds before, but there isn't, even these verses are explained in a way that the ultimate first second of creation was something out of nothing. This is like a major foundation of Torah thought. But I appreciate your saying your point of view. Anything else?
I was just going to say on the point of Bereshit. So, if you look at it from a literary point of view, Bereshit very closely parallels the Enuma Elish, right? The Babylonian creation story. And I have a copy of it, and it takes a very similar literary idea of, at first everything is empty and formless. And it's specifically, there's a relationship with water, right? In the Torah, it's Tehom, the deep. In the Enuma Elish, it's Tiamat. But in both versions of the story, prior to the empty and formless aquatic state of creation, there's nothing. Tiamat is the first thing to happen. And in the Torah, there's nothing until the creation of the unformed waters from something. It would be very odd to me if it parallels the Babylonian creation story in so many other ways, but doesn't have, aside from creation ex nihilo of the waters, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you say the Torah creation is a copy of the original, of the Babylonian creation story, the Sumerian creation story. And if it is so, then it's created and not shaped.
I think it's just like another aspect of this, right? I read it only once, and not the Torah story, but the Babylonian. I didn't really see so much parallels, but I actually saw many differences. But I guess that's a whole issue to itself. I'm sure you know it much better than me. But it's a good point. That's more if it was many years ago that I read it, but as far as I remember, that text is more into this idea of chaos and making order in chaos.
The making order from chaos thing is something that actually happens within the thing that's been created, right? Because Tiamat is both a character and a formless place, and basically the chaos itself is created, and then the gods bring order inside of Tiamat. Right. I'll send you. Remind me at the end of class. I'll put something in the WhatsApp. Rabbi Sachs has a whole Torah about this.
Like a comparison between the two texts. I think I read it once. Yeah, pretty nice. Okay, guys. So let's have a little break.
Okay, a very quick question.
Yes.
Obviously, you also have a lot of names. How should we address you?
Me?
Yeah.
Boss. Just kidding. Shlomo.
It could be worse.
Shlomo. Yeah, okay guys, so have a little lunch break now.
Just sandwiches in the fridge, will they run?
Yes.
Yeah.